Victor Callahan slammed his fist on the mahogany table so hard that the crystal glasses trembled, and in a voice that could freeze the blood of any man in New York, he snarled, "Who cooked this?" not knowing that the woman standing behind that kitchen door was about to shatter 18 months of silence and everything he thought he knew about power control and the empire he built on ice. Before we continue, if you love stories about second chances, hidden strength, and hearts that learn to beat again, hit that subscribe button and stay with me until the very end. And in the comments, tell me what city you're watching from tonight. I want to see just how far this story has traveled. Now let's begin. The dining room of the Callahan estate had not heard laughter in 18 months. It was a room built for celebration, soaring ceilings, gold-trimmed moldings, a chandelier that had once been imported from Vienna at a cost that could have fed a small town for a year. And yet every night that same chandelier hung over a table where nothing but silence was served. Victor Callahan sat at the head of that table as he did every night, dressed in a black suit, even though there was no meeting, no guest, no reason for such formality, except that formality was the only armor he had left. His shoulders were broad, his jaw sharp, his eyes the color of a winter sky, just before snow, pale, distant, and utterly without warmth. Men who had crossed him in business had described those eyes as the last thing they saw before their lives fell apart. Women who had tried over the years to soften him had described them as a wall no one could climb. Tonight, like every night before it, a plate sat in front of him, untouched. A masterpiece of some celebrated chef's skill, seared duck breast in a red wine reduction roasted root vegetables, arranged with surgical precision. A garnish of microgreens that had probably cost more than most people's weekly grocery bill. Victor looked at it the way a man looks at a stranger's face in a crowd. No interest, no hunger, nothing. He picked up his spoon not to eat, but out of habit the way a man might reach for a cigarette he no longer smoked, and set it back down without touching the food. Down the long table, seated in near total silence, was Daniel Callahan, Victor's father. Once a booming, unstoppable force of a man who had built half of this empire with his bare hands and his sharp tongue, Daniel now sat with his hands folded in his lap, his eyes drifting somewhere far away, somewhere none of the staff could follow. A stroke 2 years back had stolen pieces of him, not all at once, but slowly, like sand slipping through fingers. Some days he remembered his son's name. Some days he called out for his late wife as though she had just stepped into another room. Tonight, Daniel wasn't eating either. He simply moved his fork through his food, tracing invisible patterns on the plate, humming a tune only he could hear. At the far end of the room, half hidden behind a marble pillar, stood the head housekeeper, Margaret. She had worked in this house for over 20 years. She had seen Victor as a boy, laughing, running through these very halls, with his mother chasing after him with flour on her hands from baking cookies in the kitchen. She had seen the light in his eyes the day he got married. She had seen that light extinguished permanently on the night everything changed. She watched him now with the same expression she wore every night, quiet, aching worry carefully hidden behind professional composure. "Sir," she said softly, stepping forward, "would you like me to have the kitchen prepare something else?" Victor didn't look up. "No." "You haven't eaten anything in—" "I said no, Margaret." His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. There was a stillness in it, a finality, the tone of a man who had spent years training people not to push him twice. Margaret bowed her head slightly and stepped back into the shadows near the wall, the way she always did. She had learned over 18 months that there was nothing to be done. The doctors had examined him. The therapists had tried and failed. His own mother, before she passed 3 years earlier, had begged him in her final months to let himself feel something again. Nothing had worked. Victor Callahan had built one of the most powerful business empires on the East Coast, shipping real estate private security contracts that stretched from Manhattan to Miami. Men feared his name in boardrooms. Rivals whispered it like a curse. But in his own home, in front of a plate of food, he was nothing but a man slowly starving himself of everything, including life. And no one, not his father, not his staff, not the dozen executive chefs he had hired and fired over the past year and a half, understood why. Except perhaps for one reason buried so deep in his chest that even he refused to look at it directly. 3 weeks earlier, on the other side of the city, in a cramped one-bedroom apartment, above a laundromat that never quite stopped humming. Emily Carter sat at her kitchen table, staring at a stack of bills she had already counted 4 times, hoping the numbers might somehow change. They didn't. "Emily," her mother's voice came weakly from the bedroom. "Is that you?" "It's me, Mom." Emily forced brightness into her voice, the kind of brightness that took real effort to manufacture. "Just doing some paperwork." She stood, smoothed the wrinkles from her worn cardigan, and walked to the doorway. Her mother Grace lay propped up against 2 pillows, her face pale, her hands trembling slightly, the way they always did now, a symptom of the illness that had been eating away at her for the past year. Emily's chest tightened every time she looked at her. "You didn't eat your soup," Emily said, gently, nodding at the half-empty bowl on the nightstand. "I wasn't hungry, sweetheart." Grace's eyes, though tired, still held warmth. The same warmth Emily remembered from childhood, from countless afternoons spent in their small kitchen, watching her mother cook humming old songs, teaching her that love could be measured in a spoonful of seasoning, in the patience of a slow simmer, in the way you stirred a pot like you meant it. "You need your strength," Emily said, sitting on the edge of the bed. "Please, just a little." Grace reached out and took her daughter's hand. "You look tired, Em." "I'm fine." "You're not fine. You've been working yourself to the bone since—" Grace stopped herself, but they both knew what she meant to say. "Since you lost your job, since your name was dragged through the mud, since the whole world decided you were a thief, when we both know you've never taken a single thing that wasn't yours in your entire life." 3 months ago, Emily had been a sous chef at Lorenzo's, a mid-tier Italian restaurant in Queens, working her way up the ranks through sheer determination and talent. She had loved that kitchen, the rhythm of it, the heat, the chaos that somehow made sense once you learned to read it. She had been good. She had been proud. Then money started disappearing from the register. Small amounts at first, then larger ones. And when the owner needed someone to blame, someone whose background wasn't as protected, as connected, as convenient to defend, he chose Emily. She still remembered the moment vividly. Standing in the back office, her apron still tied around her waist, listening to accusations she couldn't disprove because the real thief, the assistant manager who had been skimming money for months, had been clever enough to make it look like it was her. "I didn't do it," she had said over and over, her voice cracking. "I would never." "Save it," the owner had snapped. "Get your things and get out, and don't expect a reference." That was it. No investigation, no second chance, just gone in the space of an afternoon, along with her reputation, her income, and the fragile stability she had spent years building for herself and her sick mother. "Emily," Grace's voice pulled her back to the present. "I don't like the look in your eyes." Emily forced a smile. "I'm just thinking about work stuff, Mom. Don't worry." "You always say that." "Because it's always true." Grace studied her daughter's face for a long moment, the way mothers do when they see straight through every lie their children try to tell them, gentle or not. "Whatever it is," she finally said, "you'll figure it out. You always do. You're the strongest person I know." Emily swallowed the lump rising in her throat and squeezed her mother's hand. "I love you, Mom." "I love you more, sweetheart." She stayed a few more minutes, tucking the blanket around her mother's shoulders, dimming the lights, humming the same old tune her mother used to hum while cooking. Only when Grace's breathing evened out into sleep did Emily allow herself to step back into the kitchen and sink into a chair, burying her face in her hands. She had applied to over 30 restaurants in the past 3 weeks. 30 rejections, some polite, some not even bothering to reply. Word had spread fast in the restaurant industry, faster than the truth ever could. She was the girl who stole from Lorenzo's. Nobody wanted that girl in their kitchen, regardless of whether the accusation was true. Rent was due in 6 days. Her mother's medication needed refilling in 4, and the number in her bank account was closer to 0 than it had ever been in her life. Her phone buzzed on the table. An unknown number. She almost didn't answer it. Most unknown numbers these days were bill collectors or scammers, but something made her pick up. "Hello? Is this Emily Carter?" A crisp, professional female voice. "Yes, this is she." "My name is Diane Whitfield. I work for a private staffing agency that places household staff for high-net-worth families. Your name came up through a former colleague of yours as someone with exceptional cooking skills and, more importantly, someone with experience caring for elderly family members. Emily blinked, caught off guard. Yes, I used to help care for my grandmother before she passed, and I've worked in restaurant kitchens for almost 8 years. Good. We have an urgent placement. A private household in Westchester is looking for someone to prepare meals and assist with light caregiving for an elderly family member. The pay is significant, more than double what you'd likely earn in a restaurant position. Room and board can also be arranged if needed, though I understand you may prefer to commute. Emily's heart began to race. That sounds incredible, honestly. But can I ask why me? I don't have any personal references from private households. There was a brief pause on the line. The family has had difficulty retaining staff. Frankly, most candidates decline once they understand the full nature of the position, or they don't last more than a few weeks once they start. We need someone resilient, someone who won't be easily intimidated. Intimidated by what exactly? Another pause, longer this time. The head of the household is a complicated man, but the position itself is straightforward. Prepare meals, assist his father with daily activities, maintain a calm and steady presence. If you're interested, I can arrange an interview for tomorrow morning. Emily glanced towards the hallway where her mother slept, toward the stack of unpaid bills on the table, toward the calendar on the wall where she had circled her mother's next doctor's appointment in red ink she could barely afford to keep. I'm interested, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. I'll take the interview. Wonderful. I'll send the address and details shortly. And Ms. Carter, I should mention the family has strict confidentiality requirements. You'll be asked to sign an agreement before beginning work. That's fine, Emily said, though something cold and uncertain settled in her stomach. When the call ended, she sat there for a long moment, staring at the phone in her hand, feeling something she hadn't felt in weeks. A flicker of hope, small and fragile, like a candle in a room full of drafts. She had no idea that this single phone call was about to change the course of her entire life. She had no idea whose house she was about to walk into. The interview took place the following morning in a sleek office building in Manhattan, sterile, corporate, entirely unlike the mansion Emily would soon come to know. Diane Whitfield turned out to be a sharp, no-nonsense woman in her 50s who reviewed Emily's resume with the efficiency of someone who had seen 1,000 candidates before her. Your culinary background is solid, Diane said, flipping through printed pages. Classical training, restaurant experience, and I see here a note about a dismissal from your previous employer. Emily's stomach dropped. That situation was complicated. I was accused of something I didn't do. I never had the chance to properly clear my name. Diane studied her for a long moment, her expression unreadable. I've done this job for over 15 years, Ms. Carter. I've learned to read people fairly quickly, and for what it's worth, I don't think you're lying to me right now. Relief washed through Emily's chest. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. The position I'm offering you is not easy. Let me be completely transparent because I owe you that much before you commit to anything. Diane leaned forward, folding her hands on the desk. You'll be working in the household of Victor Callahan. The name hit Emily like a physical weight. Even she, someone who paid little attention to business news or high society gossip, recognized that name. Everyone in New York recognized that name. The Victor Callahan, she asked carefully. The one who owns half the shipping ports on the East Coast. The very same. I've heard things about him. Most of what you've heard is probably true, and some of it is probably worse than the reality, Diane said dryly. He is not an easy man. He is demanding, cold, and frankly exhausting to work for, according to the 11 staff members who have quit in the past 18 months. But the position pays extraordinarily well, and the household desperately needs stability, particularly for his father Daniel, who requires consistent, gentle care. Emily sat quietly absorbing this information, weighing it against the reality of her empty bank account and her mother's medical bills. What exactly happened to make him this way? She found herself asking. If you don't mind me asking. Diane's expression softened slightly, the first crack in her professional composure. That's not something I'm at liberty to discuss in detail, but I'll say this much. The household experienced a profound tragedy several years ago. Since then, Mr. Callahan has become difficult to reach in every sense of the word. He has not had a proper meal in 18 months, not out of dietary restriction, simply because nothing satisfies him anymore. We've sent him some of the most celebrated chefs in the country. All of them failed. Emily frowned. Failed? How? He either fires them within days, or he simply refuses to eat what they prepare night after night until they give up and leave on their own. Diane sighed, rubbing her temples. Frankly, Ms. Carter, I'm not entirely sure why I'm sending you into that situation. Perhaps because you're the only candidate this month who didn't ask me about salary before asking me about the family. Emily blinked, surprised. She hadn't even realized she'd done that. I need this job, Emily admitted honestly, but not just for the money. My mother is sick. She needs consistent care medication, and I need stability to provide that for her. If this position gives me that, I'm willing to face whatever difficulty comes with it. Diane studied her for a long moment, then finally nodded, sliding a folder across the desk. Then let's discuss the terms. 2 days later, Emily stood outside the wrought iron gates of the Callahan estate. For the first time, her small suitcase gripped tightly in one hand, her heart pounding somewhere in her throat. The mansion loomed ahead of her like something out of a period film, stone walls covered in ivy, towering windows, manicured hedges trimmed into perfect geometric shapes. It was beautiful in the way that made Emily feel instantly, achingly small. A security guard checked her identification at the gate, speaking into a radio in a low murmur before waving her through. The long driveway wound past fountains and gardens toward the main entrance where Margaret, the head housekeeper, stood waiting with a clipboard and a carefully neutral expression. "Ms. Carter?" Margaret asked. "Yes, that's me. Follow me, please. I'll show you to the kitchen and go over your responsibilities. Mr. Callahan is currently in a business meeting and will not be available today. You'll primarily be reporting to me and assisting with Mr. Daniel Callahan's care." Emily nodded, following Margaret through the grand foyer past marble floors and oil paintings that probably cost more than her entire apartment building. The silence of the house pressed against her almost physically. No music, no chatter, no sound of life beyond the soft click of Margaret's heels against the floor. "It's very quiet here," Emily said mostly to fill the silence. Margaret's expression flickered something guarded passing behind her eyes. "You'll find that this house prefers quiet. I'd advise you to respect that, particularly around certain topics." "Which topics?" Margaret paused at the base of a grand staircase, turning to face Emily directly. "Never mention Mr. Callahan's late wife. Never ask about the locked room on the 3rd floor. And never under any circumstances push Mr. Callahan on matters he doesn't wish to discuss. Do you understand?" Emily's stomach tightened. "I understand." "Good." Margaret's tone softened slightly. "I don't say this to frighten you, Ms. Carter. I say it because I've seen good people lose their positions and sometimes their composure by not heeding this advice. This house holds a great deal of pain. The kindest thing you can do is not disturb it further." They continued walking, eventually arriving at the kitchen, a sprawling state-of-the-art space that made Emily's breath catch involuntarily. Gleaming steel counters, professional-grade ovens, a walk-in pantry stocked with ingredients Emily had only ever read about in culinary magazines. "This will be your domain," Margaret said. "Mr. Daniel typically takes his meals separately from his son in the sunroom on the east wing. You'll prepare something simple for him at each meal and assist him with basic activities throughout the day. A nurse visits twice weekly for medical needs, but day-to-day care will fall to you. And Mr. Callahan Victor," Margaret's face grew guarded again. "The main kitchen staff handles his meals separately. You will have minimal direct interaction with him, if any. That arrangement has worked best for previous staff." Emily nodded, though something in her chest twisted uncomfortably at the thought of living in a house with a man everyone seemed so afraid of, a man she would apparently be instructed to avoid entirely. She had no idea, standing there in that gleaming kitchen with her small suitcase still in hand, that within 3 weeks that very same man would be standing in this exact spot, demanding to know who had cooked the meal that finally broke through 18 months of silence. The first days passed in a careful rhythm. Emily woke early before the sun fully rose and made her way through the quiet halls to the kitchen, where she began preparing breakfast for Daniel. She learned quickly that he responded better to simple home-style dishes than to the elaborate preparations. The main kitchen staff typically produced a soft scrambled egg toast with butter, a small bowl of fruit cut into manageable pieces. "You remind me of someone," Daniel said one morning, watching her cook with unusual focus in his cloudy eyes. "Who's that Mr. Callahan?" "My wife. She used to hum while she cooked, just like you're doing now." His expression grew distant. "I can't remember her face very well anymore, but I remember the humming." Emily's chest ached at that admission. "What did she used to hum?" Daniel frowned, concentrating. "I don't remember. It's gone like so much else." "That's all right," Emily said gently, sitting beside him. "Sometimes the memories come back when you least expect them. My grandmother used to say that memories are like cats. They don't come when you call, but they'll wander back on their own time." Daniel let out a small, surprised laugh, the first genuine sound of amusement Emily had heard from him. "I like that." Small moments like these began accumulating day by day. Emily discovered that Daniel responded well to stories. She began telling him tales from her own childhood, about her grandmother's kitchen, about learning to cook by standing on a step stool at the counter, about the way her mother used to sing old songs while stirring pots on the stove. Daniel listened with rapt attention, occasionally offering fragmented memories of his own that seemed to surface unexpectedly like bubbles rising through murky water. On the fourth day, Emily made a simple beef stew from her grandmother's old recipe notebook, a worn, coffee-stained collection of handwritten recipes that had been passed down through 3 generations of women in her family. Daniel took one bite and went completely still. "Mr. Callahan," Emily asked, concerned, "is everything all right? Is it too salty?" Daniel's eyes had filled with tears. "This tastes like—" He trailed off, shaking his head slowly. "I don't know. Something familiar, something I lost a long time ago." Emily reached over and gently squeezed his hand. "That's a good thing, Mr. Callahan. It means it's still in there somewhere, waiting for you to find it again." What neither of them knew, what Emily wouldn't discover until much later, was that the recipe she had just prepared, passed down from her own grandmother, bore an uncanny resemblance to a dish Daniel's late daughter-in-law used to make. A dish that had once filled this very house with warmth before tragedy silenced it forever. It was on the 5th day that Emily first encountered Victor Callahan directly. She had been carrying a tray of tea back toward the sunroom when she rounded a corner in the east wing and nearly collided with him head-on. He was moving quickly, his expression thunderous, clearly in the middle of some private fury that had nothing to do with her. "Watch where you're—" he snapped, then stopped abruptly as his eyes landed on her face. Unfamiliar. New. "I'm so sorry, sir," Emily said quickly, steadying the tray before anything spilled. "I wasn't looking where I was going." Victor's cold eyes swept over her, her simple uniform, her tired but composed expression, the tea tray in her hands. "Who are you?" "Emily Carter, sir. I was hired to help care for your father." Something flickered across his face, surprise perhaps, or suspicion. "No one told me a new caregiver had started." "I believe Ms. Whitfield handled the arrangements directly with your housekeeper, sir." Victor's jaw tightened. He studied her for a long moment, the kind of scrutinizing stare that made most people shrink back or look away. Emily did neither. She simply held his gaze, calm and steady, the way she might look at any stranger she'd just bumped into in a hallway. "You're not afraid of me," Victor said almost accusingly. Emily blinked, caught off guard by the bluntness of the statement. "Should I be—" A long silence stretched between them. Something shifted in Victor's expression, not quite softening, but something adjacent to curiosity, buried deep beneath layers of ice. "Most people are," he said finally. "I've had a difficult few months, Mr. Callahan," Emily said carefully. "I've learned that fear rarely solves anything. It just makes people smaller." Victor stared at her for another long beat, as though trying to solve some complex equation hidden behind her calm expression. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing down the marble hallway until they faded into silence. Emily stood there for a moment, her heart hammering unexpectedly in her chest before continuing on toward the sunroom, unaware that she had just become the single most interesting thing to happen inside that house in over a year. That night, Victor sat alone in his study, a glass of untouched whiskey, sitting beside a stack of unread reports. His mind kept drifting back to the brief exchange in the hallway, to the calm, unflinching way that woman had looked at him, as though he were nothing more than an ordinary man who had simply bumped into her by accident. No fear, no calculation, no attempt to flatter or appease him. It unsettled him more than he cared to admit. He pressed a button on his desk phone. Margaret. Her voice crackled through moments later. Yes, sir. The new caregiver, Emily Carter. Tell me everything you know about her. There was a brief pause. She's been excellent with your father, sir. He's been more responsive this week than he has in months. Eating better, talking more. That's not what I asked. Another pause longer this time. I don't know much beyond her employment history, sir. Ms. Whitfield handled her hiring directly. Victor's fingers drummed against the desk, an old habit from his younger days back when patience wasn't something he'd needed to fake. Have her background thoroughly investigated. Employment history, financial records, personal associations. Everything. May I ask why, sir? Victor's eyes narrowed slightly, staring out the dark window toward the silhouette of the gardens below. Because I don't trust people who aren't afraid of me, Margaret. In my experience, they're either fools or they're hiding something far more dangerous. He had no idea, sitting there in the dim light of his study, that the investigation he was about to order would reveal not a threat, not a hidden agenda, but something far more disarming, the story of a woman who had lost everything and still somehow chosen to remain kind. He had no idea that within days, that quiet kindness would begin cracking through 18 months of frozen silence, one small act at a time, until the night would come when he would sit at that long dining table, finish an entire meal for the first time in over a year, and demand to know the name of the person who had done what no celebrated chef in America had managed to accomplish. He had no idea that the answer to that question would change everything. But that night was still 3 weeks away, and Emily Carter, walking back to her small room on the estate grounds, humming softly under her breath, the same tune her grandmother used to hum, had no idea either. No idea that the powerful, feared, untouchable man she had just spoken to in the hallway was about to become the center of a story neither of them could have predicted. A story about grief and healing and the strange, quiet ways that kindness finds its way into even the coldest, most guarded hearts. A story that was only just beginning. The investigation results landed on Victor's desk 4 days after he gave the order, and he read through them twice before he allowed himself to believe what was written there. Nothing. There was nothing. There was no debts beyond ordinary rent and medical bills, no criminal record beyond the false accusation at Lorenzo's, which the private investigator had actually bothered to look into further, uncovering security footage. The restaurant owner had conveniently never mentioned to the police footage, showing the assistant manager, not Emily, slipping bills into his own pocket during 3 separate late-night shifts. Victor stared at the grainy still image for a long time. A grainy photograph of a man stealing money while an innocent woman took the blame and lost everything because of it. She never even tried to clear her name, Victor murmured to himself, flipping to the next page. There it was, a local news clipping from 8 months earlier, a small story buried on page 6 of a community paper about a woman who found nearly $3,000 in cash stuffed inside a torn grocery bag on a subway platform and turned it in to the transit police rather than keep it, despite being unemployed at the time and behind on rent. The reporter had tried to interview her for the story. Her quote was short, "It wasn't mine. That's all there is to it." Victor closed the folder and sat in silence for a long moment, staring at nothing. He picked up his phone and dialed Margaret's extension. "Have the restaurant reviewed. Lorenzo's in Queens. I want the truth about the theft exposed and Emily Carter's name cleared publicly." "Sir," Margaret's voice carried genuine surprise. "You heard me. May I ask what prompted this?" Victor's jaw tightened. "No, you may not." He hung up before she could respond, and for a long time afterward he sat alone in his study, turning the folder over in his hands, unable to explain even to himself why the injustice done to a woman he barely knew had lodged itself so firmly beneath his ribs. 3 days later, Emily received a phone call that made her drop the spoon she was holding. "Miss Carter." This is Anthony Reyes calling from the New York Restaurant Workers Association. I don't know if you've seen the news yet, but Lorenzo's has issued a public statement retracting the theft allegations against you. Surveillance footage was released showing the actual individual responsible. There's already talk of you receiving a formal apology and possibly compensation. Emily stood frozen in the Callahan kitchen, her hand pressed against the counter to steady herself. I'm sorry, how did this even... I'm not entirely sure how the footage resurfaced, honestly. Someone leaked it to a journalist late last night. It's already circulating. I just wanted you to hear it from someone friendly before you saw it online. When the call ended, Emily stood motionless for nearly a full minute, tears blurring her vision, her chest heaving with something between relief and disbelief. Her name was clear. After months of being treated like a criminal, after doors slamming in her face at every restaurant she applied to, after nights lying awake wondering if she would ever work in a kitchen again, it was over, just like that. She didn't know who had done this. She had no way of knowing that 4 days earlier, a folder had landed on the desk of the most powerful man in the house she now worked in, and that within hours of reading it, he had made a single phone call that quietly dismantled months of injustice. She would find out eventually. But not that day. That day, she simply sank into a kitchen chair and wept. The good kind of crying, the kind that comes after carrying something unbearably heavy for far too long, and finally being allowed to set it down. Daniel noticed the change in her the moment she walked into the sunroom that afternoon, her eyes still slightly red, her smile brighter than he had ever seen it. Something good happened, he said, watching her with unusual clarity. Something wonderful happened, Mr. Callahan. Emily set down his lunch tray and sat beside him, unable to keep the smile from her face. Someone cleared my name. After everything, someone finally believed me. Daniel studied her face for a long moment. You deserved that. Thank you. No. His voice grew firmer, more present than she had heard it in days. You deserved that. Don't just say thank you like it's a small thing. Let yourself feel it. Emily blinked, caught off guard by the sudden lucidity in his tone, by the sharpness that occasionally surfaced from beneath the fog that usually clouded his mind. For a moment, she caught a glimpse of the man Daniel Callahan used to be, sharp, commanding, the kind of man who built empires and demanded that people around him take their own worth seriously. You're right, she said softly. I do deserve it. Daniel smiled, patting her hand gently. Good girl. He returned to his lunch humming that same familiar fragmented tune, and Emily sat beside him a while longer, unaware that just down the hall behind a closed office door, Victor Callahan was staring at a printed news article about the very story that had just brought her to tears, reading her retraction statement over and over, something warm and unfamiliar stirring behind his ribs, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in over 3 years. The kitchen incident happened on a Tuesday, 8 days after Emily had started working at the estate, and it happened entirely by accident. Daniel had been particularly restless that morning, more agitated than usual, refusing his breakfast twice, his hands trembling with a kind of frustration that seemed to come from somewhere deep and wordless. Emily had tried everything: soft toast, warm tea, gentle conversation, but nothing settled him. Daniel kept starting sentences and losing them halfway through, his frustration mounting with every failed attempt. I want the thing my wife used to... What thing, Mr. Callahan? Can you describe it? I can't remember the name. His hands moved helplessly through the air as though trying to shape the memory into something tangible. Beef, soft. It had beef, and it was soft, and it smelled like... He stopped, his eyes filling with tears of frustration. I can't remember. Emily's heart broke watching him struggle. On instinct, she pulled out her grandmother's recipe notebook, the same worn, coffee-stained book she carried with her every day, flipping through pages until she landed on a beef and root vegetable stew recipe. Simple, slow-cooked, seasoned with rosemary and thyme, the kind of dish that filled a kitchen with warmth on cold days. Would this help? She asked, showing him the faded handwritten page. Daniel stared at the recipe for a long moment, his breathing slowing. Maybe, he whispered. Maybe. Can you try? Of course I can try. She spent the rest of the morning in the main kitchen, chopping vegetables, browning beef, letting the stew simmer low and slow the way her grandmother had taught her decades earlier. The smell filled the kitchen, drifted down the hallway, curled around corners like something alive. She had no idea that Victor, passing through the corridor on his way to a meeting, stopped dead in his tracks. He stood frozen outside the kitchen door, his hand gripping the doorframe so tightly his knuckles turned white. The scent hit him like a physical blow. Rosemary thyme, slow-cooked beef, exactly, precisely, unmistakably the way his wife used to cook, his late wife, Sarah. For 3 years he had avoided this smell entirely. He had fired chefs simply for using rosemary in the wrong proportion. He had banned certain dishes from the household menu altogether, unable to explain why, unwilling to explain why, letting his staff assume it was simply another one of his cold, arbitrary preferences. Now it filled the hallway, thick and unavoidable, and Victor found himself unable to move, unable to breathe properly, memories crashing over him in waves he hadn't braced himself for. Margaret found him there minutes later, still standing frozen outside the kitchen door. "Sir, are you all right?" Victor's jaw was tight, his eyes distant. "Who is cooking that?" It wasn't a question. It was closer to an accusation. "The new caregiver, sir, Miss Carter. She's preparing something for your father." "Stop her. Sir, I said stop her." His voice cracked through the hallway, sharp and sudden, the loudest anyone had heard him in months. Margaret flinched visibly, taking a step back. But before either of them could move, Emily appeared in the kitchen doorway, a wooden spoon still in her hand, drawn by the commotion, her expression immediately shifting to concern at the sight of Victor's face, pale, tense, his eyes wide with something that looked almost like panic. "Mr. Callahan," she said carefully, "is everything all right? What are you cooking?" His voice was low now, dangerously quiet. "A beef stew, sir, for your father. He mentioned it reminded him of something, and I thought, turn it off." Emily blinked, confused. "I'm sorry. Turn it off, now." "Mr. Callahan, your father hasn't eaten properly all morning, and this seemed to be helping him remember." "I don't care what it's helping him remember." Victor's voice rose again, sharper this time, echoing off the marble walls. "Turn off the stove and get rid of it, immediately." Something in Emily's chest tightened, not fear exactly, but a kind of protective instinct that overrode her caution. "With respect, sir, your father was struggling this morning, and this dish is genuinely helping him. I don't understand why—" "You don't need to understand," Victor snapped. "You need to do as you're told." The words hung sharp in the air between them. Margaret shifted uncomfortably in the background, clearly wanting to intervene, but unsure how. Emily's spine straightened, something steady and unshaken settling into her expression, despite the tension radiating off Victor in waves. "I understand you're upset about something, Mr. Callahan, but I won't take away something that's helping your father simply because it upsets you for reasons you haven't explained." Victor's eyes widened slightly, genuinely startled by the pushback. No one spoke to him this way. No one had in years. "Excuse me." His voice dropped to something dangerously quiet. "I said, I understand you're upset." Emily repeated, her voice steady, despite the way her heart pounded against her ribs. "But your father asked me for this specifically. He's been struggling to remember something all morning, and this stew seemed to bring him some comfort. If there's a reason it's difficult for you, I'm happy to discuss it. But I won't simply throw away food that's helping him without understanding why." For a long, tense moment, Victor simply stared at her, something complicated churning behind his cold blue eyes, anger. Yes, but also something else, something closer to shock at being spoken to so plainly, so honestly, by someone who clearly wasn't trying to appease him or flatter him or manipulate him in any way. "You have no idea what you're talking about," he finally said, his voice quieter now, more controlled. "Then explain it to me," Emily said gently. "Please." Victor's jaw worked silently for a moment, old grief warring visibly with old anger behind his expression. Finally, without another word, he turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing sharply down the hallway, until a distant door slammed shut somewhere in the east wing. Margaret exhaled slowly, clearly relieved the confrontation was over. "You shouldn't have pushed him like that." "I wasn't trying to push him," Emily said quietly, her hands trembling slightly now that the adrenaline was fading. "I just didn't understand what I did wrong." "It's not about what you did wrong," Margaret said carefully. "It's about what that smell means to this family. I did warn you about certain topics." "You told me not to mention his wife," Emily said. "You never told me his wife used to cook this exact dish." Margaret's expression flickered with something like surprise, then something closer to sadness. "I didn't know that myself," she admitted quietly, "not until just now, watching his face." Daniel refused to eat anything else that day, except the stew Emily had prepared, insisting weakly but firmly that it was the only thing that felt right. Emily served it to him in the sunroom, watching carefully as he took the first bite, his eyes filling instantly with tears. "This is it," he whispered. "This is exactly it. I'm glad it's helping Mr. Callahan." "Sarah," he said suddenly, clearly his eyes sharpening with a lucidity that startled Emily. "My daughter-in-law. Her name was Sarah. She used to make this exact stew every Sunday. The whole house would smell like this." His voice cracked slightly. "I haven't smelled this in so long." Emily's chest tightened with sudden understanding, pieces falling into place. "Your son's wife," Daniel nodded slowly. "Victor's wife. She died." His face crumpled slightly, grief resurfacing through the fog of his condition. "It's why he's like this. It's why the house is so quiet now. He hasn't been the same since." Emily sat in stunned silence, absorbing the weight of what she had just unknowingly stumbled into. The dish she had prepared using her own grandmother's recipe, a recipe passed down through generations of her own family, entirely unconnected to the Callahans, had somehow impossibly mirrored the exact dish that had once filled this house with warmth before tragedy silenced it forever. She hadn't known. She couldn't have known. And yet, without meaning to, she had reached directly into the deepest wound in this entire household and pressed against it hard. No wonder Victor had reacted the way he had. That night, unable to sleep, Emily made her way quietly through the darkened halls toward the kitchen, intending to make herself a cup of tea to calm her racing thoughts. She didn't expect to find Victor already there, sitting alone at the small staff table in the corner, a bottle of whiskey in front of him, mostly empty. She froze in the doorway, uncertain whether to retreat or announce herself. "You can come in," Victor said without looking up, his voice rougher than usual, edged with exhaustion and something that might have been alcohol. "I'm not going to bite." Emily hesitated, then stepped inside cautiously. "I was just going to make some tea. I can come back later." "Sit down, Miss Carter." It wasn't quite a request, but it wasn't the same sharp command from earlier either. Emily studied his face for a moment. Pale, drawn, his tie loosened his usual controlled composure, noticeably absent before pulling out the chair across from him and sitting down carefully. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The kitchen was dim, lit only by a single hanging light above the table, casting soft shadows across Victor's tired features. "My father told you about Sarah," Victor finally said. It wasn't a question. "He did," Emily admitted quietly. "I'm so sorry. I had no idea the recipe would mean anything to anyone here. It's my grandmother's recipe. I've made it my whole life." Victor let out a short, humorless laugh, staring down into his glass. "What are the odds?" "I really am sorry, Mr. Callahan. If I had known, I never would have—" "Don't apologize." His voice was quiet but firm. "You didn't do anything wrong. You cooked a meal that helped my father. That's more than any of the celebrity chefs I've hired over the past year managed to accomplish." He paused, his jaw tightening. "I just wasn't prepared for the smell. It caught me off guard." Emily studied him carefully, choosing her next words with care. "Can I ask what happened to her, your wife?" Victor's expression closed off instantly, old walls slamming back into place. "That's not something I discuss." "Okay," Emily said gently, not pushing further. "You don't have to." The simple acceptance in her voice seemed to catch him off guard. He glanced up at her, studying her face for a long moment, searching for the pity or morbid curiosity he usually found in people's eyes when the topic of his wife's death arose. He found neither. "Most people push," he said quietly. "They think they're being kind by asking. They just want the story." "I'm not most people," Emily said simply. "And I don't need the story to understand that you're in pain. That's obvious enough without details." Victor stared at her for a long, unreadable moment. Something in his chest shifted, small, almost imperceptible, but real. 3 years ago, he said, suddenly surprising even himself, there was a home invasion. Men my rivals hired looking for information about a shipping contract, something that seemed important at the time and means nothing to me now. His voice grew flat, mechanical, the way people speak when reciting something they've rehearsed 1,000 times in their own mind but never said aloud. Sarah was home, alone. I was at a business dinner that ran late. By the time I got back, he stopped abruptly, his jaw clenching, unable to finish the sentence. Emily sat perfectly still, her heart aching, resisting every instinct to reach across the table and take his hand. "You don't have to say any more." She was 7 months pregnant. Victor said anyway, his voice barely above a whisper now. "We were going to have a daughter." The words landed in the quiet kitchen like a physical weight, and Emily felt her own eyes fill with sudden tears, her chest tightening painfully. "Victor," she whispered his first name, slipping out unintentionally softly without the formal title. "I'm so sorry." He didn't correct her use of his first name. He simply sat there staring down at his glass, 3 years of carefully constructed walls, trembling slightly at their foundation. "I stopped eating properly after that," he admitted quietly. "Not on purpose. Food just started tasting like nothing. Like ash. Every chef I hired, every dish, it all tasted like nothing, because none of it was ever going to be the meal she used to make, the home she used to build inside this house, with nothing but flour and patience and love." His voice cracked slightly on the last word. "And then you walked into my kitchen and made something that smelled exactly like her, using a recipe that has nothing to do with her at all, and I didn't know what to do with that." Emily reached across the table, then unable to stop herself, and gently placed her hand over his. He flinched slightly at the contact, but didn't pull away. "I can't bring her back," Emily said softly, "and I would never try to replace her, or replace what she meant to this house. But maybe some part of healing means allowing good memories back, and even the painful ones, instead of running from every reminder for the rest of your life." Victor looked up at her, his cold blue eyes glassy with unshed tears, something raw and unguarded flickering across his face for just a moment before he caught himself and looked away. "I don't know how to do that," he admitted quietly. "Neither do I most days," Emily said honestly. "But I think you start by letting yourself feel things again, even when it hurts. I think you started tonight, actually, whether you meant to or not." They sat together in comfortable silence for a while longer, the whiskey bottle forgotten between them, something unspoken but undeniable shifting in the space between two people who 3 weeks earlier had been complete strangers. The days that followed brought small, steady changes that no one in the household could ignore, though everyone seemed almost afraid to comment on them directly, as though speaking the changes aloud might somehow undo them. Daniel began remembering more each day, fragments of stories, names of old friends, entire conversations from decades earlier that surfaced unexpectedly during meals Emily prepared for him. He started asking for specific dishes by name, dishes Emily quickly learned held connections to Sarah to happier years before tragedy silenced the house. Victor began appearing in the kitchen more frequently, always with some flimsy excuse, checking on his father's schedule, reviewing household expenses with Margaret, anything that gave him a reason to linger near the warmth and noise that had slowly begun filling the space Emily occupied each day. "You don't actually need to check the grocery inventory every afternoon, sir," Margaret said dryly, one day, catching him lingering near the pantry while Emily prepared dinner nearby. "I like to stay informed about household expenses," Victor said stiffly, not quite meeting her eyes. Margaret simply raised an eyebrow and said nothing further, though the corner of her mouth twitched with the faintest hint of a knowing smile. On the 12th day, Victor sat down at the small staff table while Emily cooked, watching her work with quiet fascination. He made no effort to hide anymore. "You hum while you cook," he observed, "just like my father said." "Old habit," Emily said, smiling slightly without looking up from the vegetables she was chopping. "My grandmother used to say a kitchen without music is just a room with a stove in it." She sounds like she was a wise woman. She was. I still use her recipe notebook for almost everything. Emily nodded toward the worn, coffee-stained book sitting open on the counter. "It's basically the only thing of hers I have left." Victor studied the notebook for a moment, something thoughtful passing behind his eyes. "May I see it?" Emily hesitated only briefly before nodding, wiping her hands and carefully passing the fragile notebook across the counter. Victor flipped through the pages with unexpected gentleness, studying the faded handwriting, the small notes scribbled in margins, the occasional smudge of old flour or grease stains that had survived decades of use. "This is beautiful," he said quietly. "The way she wrote everything down, like she wanted to make sure nothing was ever lost." "That's exactly what she wanted," Emily said softly, watching him carefully. She always said, recipes are just love written down in a language anyone can follow as long as someone's willing to actually try. Victor looked up at her, then something unguarded and vulnerable flickering behind his expression, before he caught himself and looked back down at the notebook. "I'd like to hear more about her sometime, if you're willing to share." "I'd like that too," Emily said, surprised by how much she meant it. But not everyone in Victor's orbit welcomed the changes taking root inside the Callahan estate. Richard Blake had built his career standing in Victor Callahan's shadow, competing against him at every turn, losing more often than he cared to admit, watching Victor's empire expand year after year while his own business struggled to keep pace. For 3 years, Richard had watched Victor's grief consume him with a kind of patient satisfaction, knowing that a distracted, broken rival was infinitely easier to compete against than the sharp, ruthless businessman Victor used to be. Now, through careful surveillance and a network of informants planted throughout Manhattan's business circles, Richard began hearing troubling reports. Victor Callahan was showing up to meetings more focused, more present. He was smiling again, according to one particularly reliable source inside his executive team. He had even laughed during a recent negotiation, something no one on his staff could remember happening in over 3 years. Richard sat in his private office, swirling a glass of scotch, listening to his private investigator lay out the details. "Her name is Emily Carter," the investigator said, sliding a photograph across the desk. "Hired 3 weeks ago as a caregiver for Callahan's father. Cooking staff, too, apparently. Word inside the house is that Callahan's practically obsessed with her." Richard studied the photograph carefully. A woman in her late 20s, simple, unremarkable at first glance. Nothing about her that screamed danger or opportunity. And yet, "Obsessed," Richard repeated slowly, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Interesting. There's something else," the investigator added. "She was recently at the center of a theft scandal at a restaurant in Queens. Fired, publicly accused name dragged through the mud. Then out of nowhere, the accusations were retracted. Someone with real influence made that happen quietly." "Callahan," Richard murmured, understanding dawning across his face. "That's the working theory, yes." Richard leaned back in his chair, staring at the photograph for a long moment, his mind working through possibilities with the same cold calculation he applied to every business decision he made. For 3 years, Victor Callahan had been a wounded, distracted version of himself, and Richard had quietly capitalized on that weakness, expanding his own influence in the gaps Victor's grief had created. But a healed present, refocused Victor Callahan was an entirely different threat, sharper, more dangerous, capable of reclaiming everything Richard had spent the last 3 years slowly acquiring. He couldn't allow that to happen. "Find out everything about her," Richard said, finally tapping the photograph. "Her finances, her family, every weakness she has. If Callahan's healing because of this woman, then she's the fastest way to break him again." The investigator nodded and gathered his materials, leaving Richard alone in his office, staring out the window toward the distant Manhattan skyline, already formulating the first pieces of a plan that would soon threaten everything Emily and Victor had quietly begun building inside the walls of that once silent mansion. Emily had no idea 3 days later that she was being watched. She noticed it first as a strange feeling, the sense of eyes on her back, while walking through the grocery market near the estate gathering fresh ingredients for that evening's dinner. She dismissed it initially as paranoia, the lingering after effects of months spent constantly defending herself against false accusations. But the feeling persisted, sharpening into something closer to certainty when she noticed the same unfamiliar black sedan parked outside her apartment building 2 evenings in a row. The same figure sitting behind the wheel each time, watching, waiting, never approaching. She mentioned it to no one, at first uncertain if she was simply being paranoid, unwilling to sound foolish or dramatic in front of a household that had only just begun to trust her. But on the fourth night, walking home from the bus stop after her shift, she felt certain someone was following her footsteps, matching her pace exactly through the quiet residential streets near her apartment. Her heart pounded, her pace quickening instinctively, years of survival instinct kicking in, as she gripped her keys tightly between her fingers, ready to defend herself if necessary. She made it to her building safely, locking the door behind her with trembling hands, standing in the darkness of her small entryway for several long minutes, listening for footsteps outside that never came. The next morning, exhausted and shaken, she arrived at the Callahan estate earlier than usual, her nerves still frayed from the night before. Victor noticed immediately, catching her in the hallway before she reached the kitchen. "You look like you haven't slept," he said, concern evident in his voice, despite his usual careful composure. "I'm fine," Emily said automatically, the same reflexive response she'd given her mother countless times before. "Emily." His voice carried an unfamiliar gentleness, using her first name for what might have been the first time. "What happened?" She hesitated, uncertain whether to voice her fears aloud, unwilling to sound paranoid or dramatic. But something in his steady, genuine concern loosened the words from her chest, despite her hesitation. "I think someone's been following me," she admitted quietly. "For the past few days. A car outside my apartment. Footsteps last night on my way home." Victor's entire demeanor shifted instantly, concern hardening rapidly into something colder, more calculating, the sharp businessman resurfacing beneath the softer man he had slowly been becoming. "Describe the car," he said immediately. "Black, a sedan. I didn't get the license plate, it was too dark." Victor's jaw tightened, his mind already racing through possibilities, old instincts sharpening into focus. "I want you staying here at the estate from now on. There are guest rooms available. I'll have arrangements made immediately." "Victor, that's not necessary. I can't just—" "It's not a request." His voice carried the old sharpness now, but Emily understood instantly that it wasn't directed at her. It was fear, carefully disguised as authority. Fear of losing something he had only just begun allowing himself to want. "Please," he added softer this time. "Let me keep you safe, just until I understand what's happening." Emily studied his face for a long moment, seeing past the controlled exterior to the genuine worry underneath, and finally nodded. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay, I'll stay." Neither of them knew yet just how necessary that decision would soon become, or how close Richard Blake's carefully constructed plan already was to shattering everything they had quietly built together over the past 3 weeks. But that night, as Emily settled uneasily into an unfamiliar guest room down the hall from Victor's own quarters, and as Victor sat awake in his study, running through security protocols and old contacts he hadn't spoken to in years, a single black car idled outside the estate's front gates, its driver capturing photographs through a long lens, sending them directly to an office in Manhattan, where Richard Blake studied each image with cold, patient satisfaction, already 3 steps ahead of a plan that was about to change everything. Emily woke the next morning in the unfamiliar guest room to the sound of raised voices drifting up from somewhere downstairs, sharp and urgent, cutting through the usual morning quiet of the estate. She dressed quickly and made her way down the grand staircase, following the sound to Victor's study, where she found him standing behind his desk phone pressed to his ear, his knuckles white against the receiver. "I don't care what it costs," he was saying, his voice low and controlled in a way that somehow felt more dangerous than shouting. "I want a security detail on her within the hour, someone competent, someone I trust." He glanced up and saw Emily in the doorway, his expression softening fractionally before hardening again. "I have to go," he said into the phone, ending the call. "What's happening?" Emily asked, stepping inside. "My head of security pulled footage from the cameras outside the estate gates last night." Victor's jaw tightened. "The same black sedan you described was parked across the street for nearly 2 hours. Whoever it is, they're not being subtle anymore." Emily's stomach dropped. "Do you know who it is?" "I have a theory." Victor's expression darkened, old anger surfacing beneath the surface. "But I need proof before I act on it." "Victor, what aren't you telling me?" He hesitated, studying her face for a long moment before answering. I have a rival, Richard Blake. We've been competing for territory in shipping and logistics for almost a decade. He's ruthless patient, and he's spent the last 3 years watching me fall apart, quietly expanding into every gap my grief created. Victor's hands clenched at his sides. If he's found out about you, about what you mean to this house, he'll see you as a weakness, a way to hurt me. The words hit Emily like a physical blow. You think I'm in danger because of you? I think it's possible. Victor admitted, his voice heavy with something that sounded almost like guilt. And I won't forgive myself if something happens to you because you walked into my life. Emily crossed the room and took his hand, steadying them both. Then we figure this out together. I'm not going anywhere, Victor. For a moment, something raw and grateful flickered across his face before he pulled her into a tight embrace, his chin resting against the top of her head. Both of them standing in silence, unaware that the danger circling them was already far closer than either of them realized. Richard Blake sat in his private office 3 days later, reviewing a fresh stack of photographs his investigator had delivered that morning. Emily entering the estate gates each day. Emily walking through the local market. Emily standing close to Victor in a photograph taken through a long lens from across the street. Their heads bent together over something in the garden. They're getting careless, Richard murmured, studying the intimacy in Victor's posture, something he hadn't seen from his rival in over 3 years. Good. That makes this easier. His assistant, a sharp young woman named Vivian, who had worked for him for nearly 5 years, stood near the door with a tablet in hand. The financial records came back on Emily Carter. Nothing unusual. Modest income, medical debt for her mother's illness, no criminal history beyond the retracted theft accusation. Nothing we can use directly then. Richard leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers against the armrest, his mind working through alternatives. Then we manufacture something. Vivian's expression flickered with hesitation. Manufacture how exactly? Callahan cleared her name once already through his own influence. If we make it look like she's still connected to theft worse than before, something involving his own household, his people will investigate. And if the evidence is compelling enough, even he won't be able to protect her without looking like a fool blinded by infatuation. Richard smiled thinly. That's the beauty of it. We don't need to hurt her directly. We just need Victor to doubt her even for a moment. That doubt will do all the damage we need. And if he doesn't doubt her, then we escalate, Richard said, simply, his eyes cold and flat. Everyone has a breaking point, Vivian. I intend to find Emily Carter's, and I intend to use it. The first piece of the plan arrived quietly, almost invisibly, the way the most dangerous things often do. A small sum of money went missing from a household account. Margaret managed nothing dramatic, just enough to raise a question. $3,000 transferred out through an online portal that required a household staff login to access. Margaret discovered the discrepancy during her weekly reconciliation and brought it immediately to Victor's attention, her expression troubled. I don't understand it, she said, spreading printed statements across his desk. The transfer used valid credentials. Someone with access to the household accounts made this transaction. Victor studied the documents carefully, his stomach already tightening with a dread he refused to name aloud. Whose login was used? Margaret hesitated, clearly reluctant to say the words. Ms. Carter's, sir. Her credentials were used to authorize the transfer 4 nights ago at 2:47 in the morning. The study fell silent. Victor stared at the paper in front of him, his jaw working silently, old instincts warring violently against the trust he had only just begun allowing himself to feel. That's impossible, he said finally, his voice tight. Emily doesn't even have access to that portal. I never gave her those credentials. The system shows otherwise, sir. Victor pushed back from his desk and stood abruptly, pacing toward the window, his mind racing through possibilities, refusing to accept the obvious conclusion the evidence seemed to be pointing toward. Someone set this up, he said finally, more to himself than to Margaret. Someone gained access to her credentials without her knowledge. With respect, sir, I've worked in this house for over 20 years, and I've seen this exact pattern before with other staff members. I don't want to believe it either. But the evidence is right in front of us. Victor turned sharply, his eyes flashing with something dangerously close to fury. You think she's stealing from this household after everything she's done for my father, after everything... He stopped himself, breathing hard, aware of how defensive his voice had become. Margaret studied him carefully, her expression softening with something like sympathy. "I think, sir, that you care about her deeply, and that's clouding your judgment right now. I'm not accusing her. I'm simply telling you what the records show. I think we need to investigate properly before jumping to any conclusions one way or another." Victor closed his eyes, forcing himself to breathe, to think rationally, despite the storm of emotion churning through his chest. "Fine," he said finally. "We investigate, quietly. I don't want her to know about this until we have real answers." He had no idea, standing there in his study, with the fabricated evidence spread across his desk, that he had just fallen directly into the first stage of Richard Blake's carefully constructed trap. Emily noticed the shift in Victor almost immediately, though she couldn't identify its cause. He grew quieter over the following 2 days, his warmth replaced by something guarded and distant, his eyes carrying a weight she didn't understand. "Did I do something wrong?" she finally asked him on the third evening, finding him alone in his study staring blankly at a stack of untouched paperwork. Victor looked up, something flickering across his face, before he schooled it back into careful neutrality. "No. Why would you ask that?" "Because you've barely spoken to me in 2 days," Emily said, hurt, evident in her voice, despite her attempt to keep it steady. "You've been avoiding me. I thought—" She stopped herself, embarrassed by how much emotion had crept into her voice. "You thought what?" Victor asked quietly. "I thought we were building something." Emily admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought you trusted me." Something in Victor's chest ached at the raw honesty in her voice, at the vulnerability she rarely allowed herself to show. He wanted desperately to tell her everything about the missing money, about the fabricated evidence, about the doubt Margaret's investigation had planted, despite his best efforts to reject it. But some old cautious instinct held him back. "I've just had a lot on my mind," he said, instead the lie tasting bitter in his mouth. "Business matters. It has nothing to do with you." Emily studied his face for a long moment, clearly sensing the evasion, but choosing not to push further. "Okay," she said softly, disappointment evident in her tone. "If you need space, I understand." She left the study quietly, and Victor sat alone in the silence afterward, hating himself for the lie, hating the doubt that had somehow wormed its way into his chest, despite everything he knew about her character, everything his own investigation had revealed weeks earlier about the kind of person Emily Carter truly was. He didn't yet realize that his silence, his distance, was exactly the wedge Richard Blake needed to drive between them. The second piece of the plan arrived 4 days later, far more damaging than the first. Margaret's internal investigation, quietly conducted with the help of the household's IT security consultant, uncovered what appeared to be a pattern of financial irregularities stretching back nearly 2 weeks. Small transfers carefully disguised, all traced back to credentials associated with Emily's household login, all occurring during hours when Emily would have had unsupervised access to the household systems. The total came to just over $11,000. Victor sat in his study, staring at the compiled report, feeling something cold and heavy settle into his stomach. He wanted desperately to believe there was an innocent explanation, that someone had hacked her credentials, that this was all some elaborate mistake. But the pattern was too consistent, too carefully documented, and old wounds, old betrayals from years of business dealings where trust had been repeatedly weaponized against him, began whispering doubts he couldn't fully silence. "I want her questioned," he said finally, his voice flat and controlled despite the storm raging beneath the surface. "Tonight, in my study?" Margaret hesitated. "Sir, are you certain this still feels—" "I said tonight, Margaret." Emily arrived in the study that evening, expecting perhaps another quiet, distant conversation, or possibly an apology for Victor's recent coldness. What she found instead was a room heavy with tension, Victor standing behind his desk with a stack of papers in front of him, his expression carved from stone, Margaret standing silently near the door. "Victor," Emily asked carefully, immediately sensing something was deeply wrong. "What's going on?" "Sit down, Ms. Carter." The formal address hit her like a slap. She hadn't been Ms. Carter to him in weeks. "Victor, you're scaring me. What happened?" "Sit down," he repeated, his voice tight and controlled. Emily sat slowly, her heart pounding, watching as Victor slid the stack of papers across the desk toward her. "Explain this," he said. Emily picked up the papers with trembling hands, scanning through transaction records, dates, amounts, all connected to a household account portal she had never even known existed. "Victor, I don't understand what I'm looking at. I've never seen these documents before in my life. These transfers were made using your login credentials," Victor said, his voice carefully devoid of emotion, though Emily could see the storm raging behind his eyes. $11,000 over the past 2 weeks, all during hours you had access to the estate systems. Emily's face drained of color, the papers shaking visibly in her hands. "I have never accessed any household financial system. I don't even know the login information for something like this. Victor, you have to believe me. The evidence says otherwise." "The evidence is wrong!" Emily's voice cracked, panic and hurt rising together in her chest. "Someone is lying, or someone set this up, but it wasn't me. I would never do something like this, especially not to you, not after everything." "Then explain the timestamps." Victor cut in, his voice rising slightly despite his obvious effort to remain controlled. "Explain how transfers using your credentials happened at exactly the hours you were alone in this house, unsupervised with full access to every system." "I can't explain it because I didn't do it." Emily stood abruptly, tears streaming down her face, now her hands still clutching the damning papers. "Victor, look at me. Do you actually believe I would steal from this family? After everything your father has shared with me, after everything we've—" Her voice broke completely. "After everything we've built together these past few weeks." Victor stared at her, something visibly fracturing behind his controlled expression. Old grief and old betrayal warring violently against the trust he had slowly, carefully allowed himself to build with her. "I don't know what to believe anymore," he admitted quietly, his voice raw with pain. "I want to believe you. God, Emily, I want to believe you more than anything. But the evidence is right here, and I've been burned before by people I trusted completely." "Then trust your instincts instead of a piece of paper," Emily pleaded, stepping closer. "You know me, Victor. You know who I am." "I thought I did." The words came out broken, barely above a whisper. Emily flinched as though struck, the pain in his voice cutting deeper than any accusation could have. "So that's it. 3 weeks and you're just going to believe I'm capable of this?" Victor said nothing, his jaw clenched tight, unable to meet her eyes directly. "Fine," Emily whispered, setting the papers down on his desk with trembling hands. "Do whatever you need to do. Fire me, call the police, I don't care anymore. But know that I never touched a single dollar of this family's money, and someday when the truth comes out, I hope you remember this moment and understand exactly how much it cost you." She turned and walked out of the study, her shoulders shaking with barely contained sobs, leaving Victor standing alone with Margaret, the damning evidence spread across his desk, and a hollow, aching feeling in his chest that told him somewhere beneath the doubt and old wounds that he had just made a terrible mistake. Daniel found her an hour later, sitting alone in the darkened kitchen, her face buried in her hands, quiet sobs shaking her shoulders. "Emily." His voice, unusually clear and present, carried genuine concern as he shuffled slowly into the room, leaning on his cane. "What's wrong, dear?" Emily looked up quickly, wiping at her tear-streaked face. "Mr. Callahan, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to disturb you." "Nonsense." Daniel settled carefully into the chair across from her, his weathered hand reaching out to cover hers. "Tell me what happened." Between broken breaths, Emily explained everything. The missing money, the fabricated evidence, Victor's cold accusations, the devastating way he had looked at her as though she were a stranger, a criminal, someone capable of betraying the trust they had built together. Daniel listened quietly, his expression growing increasingly troubled as she spoke. When she finished, he sat in silence for a long moment, his thumb gently stroking the back of her hand. "My son has been hurt terribly," he finally said, his voice heavy with old sorrow. "More terribly than most people ever understand. Fear does strange things to a wounded heart, Emily. It makes people doubt even the truths sitting right in front of them." "That doesn't make it hurt any less," Emily whispered. "No," Daniel agreed gently. "It doesn't. But I've known my son his entire life, and I've never seen him care about anyone the way he cares about you. Not since Sarah." His eyes grew distant for a moment, memory surfacing through the fog. Give him time. The truth has a way of surfacing eventually, especially when it's protected by someone as genuinely good as you are. Emily managed a small, watery smile. Thank you, Mr. Callahan. Daniel, he corrected gently. Please, call me Daniel. She squeezed his hand gratefully, comforted slightly by his steady presence, unaware that just down the hall, Victor sat alone in his darkened study, staring at the evidence on his desk, an unshakable feeling gnawing at his gut that something about this entire situation felt fundamentally wrong. It was nearly midnight when Victor finally acted on that feeling, calling his head of IT security directly rather than waiting until morning. I need you to trace the origin point of these transactions. Victor said, his voice sharp with renewed urgency. Not just the credentials used, but the actual device and network location where each transfer originated. That'll take some time, sir, but it's possible. Give me until morning. Victor paced his study for hours afterward, unable to sleep. Replaying Emily's devastated expression over and over in his mind, her broken voice insisting on her innocence, the genuine hurt in her eyes when he'd failed to immediately believe her. He thought of his investigation weeks earlier, the clean record that returned money on the subway platform, the years of sacrifice for her ailing mother. He thought of the fabricated theft accusation at Lorenzo's, the injustice he had personally moved to correct, because something about the situation had felt deeply wrong even then. Why had he been so quick to doubt her now? The answer, when it finally surfaced through the fog of his exhausted mind, was uncomfortable and clear, because doubt was safer than hope. Because if he allowed himself to fully trust her, fully love her, and then lost her the way he had lost Sarah, he wasn't certain he would survive it a second time. He had let fear make his decision for him. And in doing so, he had potentially destroyed the one good thing that had walked into his life in over 3 years. The IT security report arrived at 7 the following morning, and Victor read through it with mounting horror. Every fraudulent transaction had originated not from the estate's internal network, but from an external IP address traced to a private security firm with known connections to Blake Industries, Richard Blake's company. The credentials used weren't stolen through any hacking of Emily's actual login. They had been created entirely from scratch, a fake account designed to mirror her real one closely enough to fool a cursory investigation, but distinct enough for a thorough forensic trace to expose the deception. Victor stared at the report, his hands shaking with a fury he hadn't felt in years. Richard had done this. Richard had fabricated evidence, weaponized his own paranoia and old wounds, and used it to nearly destroy the one relationship that had finally begun pulling him back from the edge of permanent isolation. And Victor, blinded by fear and old betrayal, had walked directly into the trap without hesitation. He stood abruptly, the report clutched in his hand, and moved quickly through the halls of the estate, searching for Emily with an urgency bordering on desperation. He found Margaret first, near the kitchen. "Where is she?" he demanded. Margaret's expression was grim. "She packed a bag an hour ago, sir. She said she couldn't stay somewhere she wasn't trusted. I tried to convince her to wait, but where did she go? I don't know, sir. She wouldn't say." Victor's stomach dropped, panic rising rapidly in his chest. He pulled out his phone and dialed her number immediately, only to hear it ring twice before going straight to voicemail. "Emily," he said after the beep, his voice raw and desperate. "Please call me back. I know the truth now. I know none of this was your fault. Please just call me back so I can explain, so I can apologize properly, please." He hung up and immediately dialed his head of security. "I need Emily Carter's location, now. Track her phone if you have to. I don't care what it takes." But even as he issued the order, a horrible thought crept into his mind, cold and sharp as a blade. If Richard Blake was willing to fabricate financial evidence to drive a wedge between them, what else might he be willing to do now that his first plan had failed? How far would a man desperate enough to manufacture false theft, accusations actually go to ensure Victor Callahan never fully recovered from his grief? Victor's blood ran cold as the pieces clicked together in his mind. Emily wasn't just heartbroken and alone somewhere in the city. She might be in genuine danger. Emily walked for nearly an hour after leaving the estate, her suitcase heavy in her hand, her phone buzzing repeatedly in her pocket, with calls she refused to answer. Each buzz felt like another small wound reopening Victor's name, flashing across the screen over and over. And every time she looked down at it, she felt the same devastating replay of his cold expression in that study, the way he had looked at her like a stranger, like someone capable of betrayal. She finally stopped at a small diner 2 miles from the estate. Sinking into a corner booth, ordering a coffee, she had no intention of drinking, just needing somewhere warm to sit while she figured out what came next. Her phone buzzed again. She glanced down instinctively, expecting Victor's name, but instead saw an unfamiliar number with a New York area code. She almost didn't answer, but something made her pick up. Hello. Emily Carter. A smooth, unfamiliar male voice, polished and confident in a way that immediately put her on edge. Who is this? My name is Richard Blake. I believe you're familiar with the name given your recent employment. Emily's stomach tightened. She had heard Victor mention that name once briefly the night he'd told her about his rival. What do you want? I want to help you, Richard said smoothly. I know what happened tonight. I know Victor accused you of something you didn't do. It must have been devastating being cast aside like that after everything you did for that family. How do you know what happened? Emily's voice sharpened with suspicion. I have my sources, Richard said vaguely. Look, Miss Carter, I'll be direct with you because I respect that you've been through enough dishonesty for one lifetime. I know the evidence used against you was fabricated. I know exactly who fabricated it. Emily's breath caught. You know who did this to me? I do. And I'm willing to give you proof, real proof enough to clear your name completely and expose the person responsible if you're willing to meet with me tonight. Every instinct in Emily's body screamed caution, an old survival reflex sharpened by months of injustice and betrayal. Why would you help me? You don't even know me. Let's just say Victor Callahan and I have a complicated history, and I have my own reasons for wanting certain truths to come to light. Richard said, his tone carefully measured. But make no mistake, Ms. Carter, the evidence I have will clear your name entirely. Surely that's worth an hour of your time. Emily hesitated, torn between suspicion and desperate hope. Her name had already been dragged through the mud once before, and the thought of clearing it a second time, of finally understanding who had done this and why, felt like a lifeline she couldn't afford to ignore. Where? She finally asked. There's a private meeting room at the Ashford Hotel, downtown Suite 1204. Come alone. I promise you'll leave with everything you need to expose the truth. Meanwhile, back at the estate, Victor's security team had triangulated Emily's phone location to the small diner only to discover upon a security detail's arrival 20 minutes later that she had already left. She got a call. The diner's waitress told Victor's security officer when questioned, remembering the young woman who had barely touched her coffee. Seemed upset by it, left right after in a hurry. Victor received the update over the phone while pacing frantically through his study, his chest tight with a fear he hadn't experienced since the night Sarah died. Do we have any idea where she went? Not yet, sir. We're pulling traffic camera footage from the area now. Move faster, Victor snapped, ending the call before immediately dialing his head of security again. I want everything you have on Richard Blake's current locations, properties, offices, anywhere he might be tonight. Sir, if I may ask why the urgency specifically around Blake tonight, Victor's blood ran cold as the pieces continued clicking together with horrifying clarity. Because if he fabricated evidence to drive her away from this house, he's not finished. Men like Richard don't create half a plan. He wanted her isolated, vulnerable, and out in the open exactly like she is right now. The Ashford Hotel's 12th floor was quiet, elegant, and utterly unremarkable. When Emily arrived 40 minutes later, her nerves buzzing with a mixture of hope and lingering suspicion. She found Suite 1204 exactly where Richard had described, knocking hesitantly on the polished door. Richard Blake opened it himself, dressed impeccably in a tailored suit, his smile polished and practiced in a way that immediately made Emily's skin prickle with unease. Miss Carter, he said warmly, stepping aside to let her in. Thank you for coming. I know this must be an incredibly difficult night for you. Emily stepped inside cautiously, taking in the room a private lounge area, a small bar cart, a leather folder sitting prominently on the coffee table. You said you had proof. Evidence that clears my name. I do, Richard said, settling into an armchair and gesturing for her to sit across from him. But first, I think you deserve to understand exactly what's been happening around you these past few weeks. Victor Callahan and I have been rivals for nearly a decade, fierce competitors in shipping and logistics. For the past 3 years since his wife's tragic passing, he's been, let's say, considerably weaker as an adversary, distracted, grief-stricken. "I don't need a history lesson," Emily said sharply, her patience thinning. "Where's the evidence?" Richard's smile didn't waver. "Patience, Ms. Carter. I'm explaining the context because it matters. When Victor began healing because of you specifically, I recognized an immediate threat to my own interests. A focused present Victor Callahan is infinitely more dangerous to me than the broken man he's been for the past 3 years. Emily's stomach dropped, cold dread creeping through her chest as understanding began dawning. "You fabricated the evidence." "I did," Richard admitted simply without a hint of shame. "Very cleanly, I might add. Untraceable, or so I believed, until this morning when my sources informed me Victor's security team had already exposed the origin point of the fraudulent transactions." Emily's hands clenched into fists in her lap, fury rising rapidly beneath her shock. "You destroyed my reputation, humiliated me in front of the family I've come to care about, all to protect your own business interests." "Business is rarely gentle, Ms. Carter," Richard said coldly, the warm mask finally slipping away entirely, revealing something colder and far more calculating underneath. "And I'm afraid tonight you've become considerably more useful to me than I originally anticipated." Emily's blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" Richard rose from his chair, moving toward the door with unhurried confidence, and Emily heard the distinct click of a lock turning. "Victor's security team is very good," Richard said almost conversationally, as though discussing the weather. "Faster than I expected, honestly. Which means my original plan using fabricated evidence to simply create doubt has already failed. But you being here alone in a hotel room registered under a false name gives me considerably more leverage than I originally anticipated." Emily's heart pounded violently against her ribs, every instinct screaming danger. "Leverage for what?" "Victor Callahan has spent 3 years building walls no one could break through," Richard said, studying her with cold clinical interest. "Then you walked in and dismantled them within weeks. That makes you valuable, Ms. Carter. Valuable enough to ensure Victor makes certain business concessions he's been stubbornly refusing to make for the past 2 years. You're insane if you think you can just keep me here," Emily said, her voice shaking despite her attempt at defiance, already scanning the room for any possible exit, any way to escape. "Perhaps," Richard said with a thin smile, "but I've found that desperate men, and I imagine Victor is quite desperate right now searching frantically for you, tend to be remarkably cooperative when properly motivated." He pulled out his phone, dialing a number Emily couldn't see, his eyes never leaving her face. "Victor," he said smoothly into the receiver a moment later, "I believe you're looking for someone." Victor's blood turned to ice the instant he heard Richard's voice through the phone, his entire body going rigid with barely contained fury. "Where is she?" Victor said, his voice deadly quiet, more dangerous than any shout could have been. "Safe for now," Richard said calmly. "Though how long that remains true depends entirely on you." "If you touch a single hair on her head, I will end you, Richard. I will burn every single thing you've ever built to the ground." "Threats are unnecessary," Richard said, smoothly unbothered. "I simply want to discuss the Hensley shipping contracts you've been blocking me from for the past 2 years. Sign over the northern route rights, and Miss Carter walks out of this hotel completely unharmed within the hour." Victor's hand gripped the phone so tightly, his knuckles turned white. "Put her on the phone, now!" There was a brief pause, some muffled movement, and then Emily's shaking voice came through the line. "Victor!" Relief and terror crashed through Victor simultaneously at the sound of her voice. "Emily, are you hurt? Has he touched you?" "I'm okay," she said, though her voice trembled audibly. "Victor, I'm so sorry. I should never have come here. I just wanted to clear my name. I didn't know." "This isn't your fault," Victor said fiercely. "None of this is your fault. Do you understand me? I'm coming for you right now. Just hold on." Richard's voice cut back and cold and businesslike. "Touching reunion. Now about those contracts." "I'll sign whatever you want," Victor said immediately, without hesitation. "Just let her go, right now. I don't care about the contracts, Richard. I never did." Something flickered in Richard's tone, surprised perhaps at how quickly Victor had capitulated. How refreshing. Very well. Come alone to the Ashford Hotel Suite 1204. Bring the signed documents, any hint of police involvement, and I assure you this situation becomes considerably more complicated. The line went dead. Victor stood frozen for only a moment before snapping into motion, adrenaline and fury, propelling him forward with singular focus. He grabbed his car keys, ignoring his head of security's protests about waiting for proper backup. "Sir, please let us handle this properly. Let the team coordinate. There's no time," Victor snapped, already moving toward the door. "Follow at a distance if you have to, but I am not leaving her in that room a moment longer than necessary." The drive to the Ashford Hotel passed in a blur of screeching tires and racing thoughts. Victor's mind cycling relentlessly through every possible scenario, every way this could go catastrophically wrong. He thought of Sarah, of the night he'd arrived home too late to save her of the helpless fury and grief that had consumed him for 3 years afterward. He would not lose Emily the same way. He refused to let history repeat itself. He arrived at the hotel in record time, moving through the lobby with barely contained urgency, forcing himself to slow his pace as he approached the elevator, aware that panic would serve no one, least of all Emily. The 12th floor was quiet unnervingly, so as Victor made his way towards Suite 1204, a folder of hastily signed documents clutched in his hand, documents his lawyer had drafted and rushed over. Within 20 minutes, documents Victor hadn't even bothered reading closely, caring only about getting Emily out safely. He knocked once sharply. The door opened to reveal Richard Blake, calm and composed as ever, gesturing him inside with mock politeness. "Victor, do come in." Victor stepped inside, his eyes immediately finding Emily seated on a couch, across the room, visibly shaken, but physically unharmed, relief flooding through him at the sight of her safe. "Emily," he breathed, moving toward her instinctively. Ah, Richard said, stepping between them with a raised hand. "Documents first, Victor, then reunions." Victor's jaw tightened, but he handed over the folder without hesitation, watching with barely restrained fury as Richard flipped through the pages, examining each signature carefully. "Excellent," Richard said, finally closing the folder with evident satisfaction. "Pleasure doing business with you, Victor. As agreed, Ms. Carter is free to stop right there." The voice came from the doorway, sharp and authoritative, and Victor turned to see 3 plainclothes police officers stepping into the room, followed closely by his head of security, who offered Victor an apologetic but determined expression. "I had a feeling you might do something reckless, sir," the security chief said quietly. "So I called in a favor with the department the moment you left the estate. Kidnapping and extortion don't require your cooperation to prosecute Mr. Callahan, just evidence. And a phone call I recorded happens to provide plenty of that." Richard's composed expression finally cracked fury and panic flashing across his face as the officers moved toward him. "This is absurd. I've done nothing illegal. Coercing a signature through threats against a private citizen's safety is extortion, Mr. Blake," one of the officers said calmly, already reaching for handcuffs. "And unlawfully detaining someone against their will is kidnapping. I'd advise you to remain quiet until you speak with an attorney." Richard's eyes flashed toward Victor with pure venom as the officers restrained him. "This isn't over, Callahan. It is for you," Victor said coldly, watching with grim satisfaction as Richard was led from the room, still protesting loudly, his carefully constructed empire of leverage and manipulation crumbling in real time. The moment the door closed behind them, Victor's controlled composure finally shattered entirely. He crossed the room in 3 quick strides and pulled Emily into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe, his entire body trembling with the release of hours of pent-up terror. "I thought I'd lost you," he whispered into her hair, his voice cracking. "I thought history was repeating itself, and I couldn't survive that a second time." Emily clung to him just as tightly, tears streaming freely down her face, now that the danger had finally passed. "I'm here. I'm okay, Victor. I'm right here." "I should never have doubted you," Victor said, pulling back just enough to look into her eyes, his own filled with raw, unguarded emotion. "The moment I saw that evidence, I let fear make my decisions instead of everything I actually knew about who you are. I am so deeply sorry, Emily. You deserved better than that from me." "You were scared," Emily said softly, reaching up to gently touch his face. "I understand that more than you know. Fear makes all of us do things we regret." "That doesn't excuse it." "No," Emily agreed. "But it explains it. And I forgive you, Victor, because I saw how quickly you came for me the moment you knew the truth. That matters more than the mistake itself." Victor closed his eyes, leaning his forehead gently against hers, both of them standing in silence for a long moment, simply breathing, simply grateful to be together safe, the nightmare of the evening finally beginning to recede. The following days brought a flurry of activity as the full scope of Richard Blake's scheme came to light. Investigators uncovered not only the fabricated financial evidence used against Emily, but an extensive pattern of similar tactics Richard had employed against other business rivals over the years. Manufactured scandals planted evidence, carefully orchestrated leverage designed to destroy reputations and force unfavorable business decisions. The story broke publicly within a week, dominating headlines across New York's business press. Richard Blake's empire, built on years of manipulation and deceit, began collapsing rapidly as former business partners and associates distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with the unfolding scandal. Victor, for his part, made a decision that surprised everyone who knew him, including himself. "I want the contracts returned," he told his lawyer during a meeting 3 days after the incident. "Every concession Richard extorted from me that night. I don't want anything built on coercion, even coercion used against him. Sir, legally you're under no obligation to return anything. He committed the crime, not you." "I know," Victor said quietly, "but I'm done building things on leverage and fear. If I'm going to rebuild this company, this family, I want it built on something better than that." The lawyer studied him for a long moment before nodding something like respect, flickering behind his professional composure. "I'll draft the necessary documents." Daniel greeted the news of Richard's arrest with a satisfaction that surprised everyone, his usual gentle demeanor sharpening momentarily into something closer to the formidable businessman he had once been decades earlier. "Good," he said firmly when Victor explained everything that had happened. "That man has been a thorn in this family's side for years. I never trusted him, not even when your mother was still alive." "You remember Richard?" Victor asked, surprised by the clarity in his father's voice. "I remember more than people give me credit for," Daniel said, a hint of dry humor coloring his tone. "The fog comes and goes, son. It doesn't erase everything permanently, just rearranges things sometimes." Victor sat beside his father, taking his weathered hand gently. "I almost lost her dad, because I let old fear make a decision that could have destroyed everything good that's happened in this house over the past few weeks." Daniel squeezed his son's hand firmly. "But you didn't lose her. You corrected your mistake the moment you understood the truth. That matters, Victor. That's the difference between a man ruled by his fear and a man who's learning slowly to overcome it." "I don't deserve her forgiveness." "Probably not," Daniel said bluntly, surprising a startled laugh out of Victor. "None of us deserve the grace people extend to us when we fail them. That's rather the entire point of grace, son. It's given anyway." Victor sat with his father in comfortable silence for a while afterward, something settling and healing quietly in his chest, the weight of 3 years of grief and isolation finally beginning to lift in earnest. Emily returned to the estate 2 days later, having spent time processing everything that had happened, needing space to breathe before stepping back into a home that had nearly torn itself apart around her. Victor met her at the front gates personally, refusing to let anyone else greet her, first standing nervously beside his car as she stepped out of the taxi that had brought her back. "You came back," he said quietly, relief evident in every line of his body. "I told you I wasn't going anywhere," Emily said, a small smile tugging at her lips, despite the lingering exhaustion in her eyes. "I meant it. Even after everything. Especially after everything," Emily said, stepping closer. "You proved something to me that night, Victor. When it mattered most, you chose me over everything else, over pride, over old fear, over every instinct telling you to protect yourself by staying distant. That's not nothing." Victor reached out slowly, giving her every opportunity to step back if she wanted, and gently cupped her face in his hands. "I love you," he said quietly. the words falling naturally, honestly, without any of the careful control he usually wrapped around his emotions. I think I've loved you since the night you told me you weren't afraid of me. I just didn't know what to do with that feeling, because I hadn't let myself feel anything that big in 3 years. Emily's breath caught tears welling in her eyes. I love you too, she whispered. Even when you were doubting me, even when I was furious and hurt, some part of me already knew I loved you. That's probably why it hurt so badly in the first place. Victor leaned down slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, and when she didn't, he kissed her gently, softly, 3 years of frozen grief finally beginning to thaw completely in that single quiet moment. Neither of them noticed Margaret watching from the front window, a wide, uncharacteristic smile spreading across her face, or Daniel standing beside her, humming softly under his breath, the same tune Emily would later learn that Sarah used to hum while cooking, finally fully remembered after 3 long years lost in the fog. The house that had stood silent for 18 months was at long last beginning to remember what it felt like to hold love within its walls again. The weeks that followed Richard Blake's arrest brought a kind of quiet transformation to the Callahan estate that no one, not even Emily, could have fully anticipated. Victor began therapy the same week Emily returned a decision he made entirely on his own, without anyone pushing him toward it. He sat across from Emily at breakfast one morning, turning a business card over in his fingers, his expression uncharacteristically vulnerable. I found a grief counselor, he admitted, someone who specializes in trauma and loss. I called yesterday and set up an appointment for Thursday. Emily reached across the table and took his hand. That's a brave thing to do, Victor. I almost lost you because I let 3 years of unprocessed grief make decisions for me, he said quietly. I don't want fear running my life anymore. I want to actually live it. With you, if you'll still have me. I'm not going anywhere, Emily said, echoing the same promise she'd made weeks earlier, and this time neither of them doubted it for a second. The therapy wasn't easy. Some weeks Victor came home from his sessions quiet and withdrawn, wrestling silently with memories he'd spent 3 years burying. Emily learned not to push during those evenings, simply sitting beside him sometimes in comfortable silence, sometimes cooking something simple, while he watched from the kitchen table, slowly working through whatever the session had unearthed. Today we talked about the night Sarah died. He told her one evening, his voice raw. The counselor asked me to describe what I remembered. I hadn't said it out loud in 3 years. How did it feel? Emily asked gently. Like ripping off a scab that never properly healed, Victor admitted. Painful, but also strangely like something finally being let out instead of buried deeper. Emily squeezed his hand. That's what healing actually looks like, Victor. It's rarely comfortable, but it's honest. Over the following months, Victor's progress became increasingly visible to everyone around him. He laughed more freely. He asked about people's days with genuine curiosity instead of distracted politeness. He started attending his father's physical therapy sessions personally rather than simply funding them from a distance. Daniel, in turn, continued improving steadily, memories surfacing more frequently, his mind clearer on more days than not. The doctors called it remarkable, attributing much of the progress to the consistency, warmth, and genuine connection Emily had brought into his daily care. You gave me back pieces of myself I thought were gone forever, Daniel told her one afternoon sitting in the garden while Emily trimmed roses nearby. Not just memories, purpose, something to wake up for each morning. You gave me that too, Daniel, Emily said, smiling. I needed somewhere to belong just as much as you needed someone to remind you who you are. Emily's mother, Grace, met Victor for the first time nearly 2 months after the Ashford Hotel incident, a meeting Emily had been anxious about for weeks, despite Victor's repeated reassurances. She's going to love you, Emily insisted the morning of the visit, straightening his collar with trembling hands. Just be yourself. What if myself isn't good enough? Victor asked, uncharacteristically nervous, a stark contrast to the controlled, commanding businessman most of New York feared. You're more than good enough, Emily said firmly. You just don't know it yet. Grace, propped up in her hospital bed during a particularly difficult week of treatment, studied Victor carefully as he entered her room, his hands full of flowers he'd insisted on picking out personally rather than delegating to staff. So, you're the man who's been making my daughter glow like she hasn't in years? Grace said, a knowing smile playing at her lips despite her evident exhaustion. Victor knelt beside her bed, taking her frail hand gently in his. I'm the man who's incredibly lucky your daughter walked into my life, Mrs. Carter. I don't deserve her, honestly, but I intend to spend the rest of my life trying to. Grace's eyes filled with tears, glancing toward Emily with unmistakable warmth. I like him, she said simply. Keep this one, sweetheart. I intend to, Mom. Victor made good on more than kind words that day. Within a week, Grace was transferred to one of the finest specialized treatment centers in the country, all expenses covered, without ever being discussed, without ever being framed as a transaction or a favor. Just quiet, steady support offered the way genuine love offers things without conditions, without expectation of repayment. You didn't have to do that, Emily said, overwhelmed when she discovered the arrangements. I know, Victor said simply. I wanted to. Your mother raised the woman who saved my entire family, Emily. Taking care of her isn't a burden. It's an honor. 6 months after Emily first walked through the gates of the Callahan estate as a stranger seeking desperate employment, Victor stood in that same kitchen where everything had begun, watching her prepare dinner with the same quiet hum she always carried while cooking. I need to ask you something, he said, his voice carrying a nervous edge Emily had rarely heard from him. She turned, wiping her hands on a dish towel, immediately noticing something different in his posture, something careful and deliberate. What is it? Victor reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box, and Emily's breath caught instantly, her hands flying to her mouth. Emily Carter. Victor said, his voice thick with emotion, as he knelt before her in the very kitchen where she'd once stood, accused, once doubted, once nearly lost everything she'd fought so hard to rebuild. 6 months ago, I asked who cooked the meal that broke through 18 months of silence in this house. I didn't know then that the answer to that question would become the answer to every question I've asked myself since, about healing, about trust, about what it actually means to live again instead of simply existing. He opened the box, revealing a simple, elegant ring that caught the kitchen light. I love you, completely unconditionally, in every broken and healed piece of who I am. Will you marry me? Emily's tears fell freely now, her hands trembling as she reached for him. Yes, she whispered, then louder, stronger, certain. Yes, Victor, 1,000 times yes. He rose and pulled her into his arms, kissing her deeply, both of them laughing through tears, unaware that Margaret and Daniel stood watching from the doorway, Margaret dabbing at her own eyes with a handkerchief, Daniel smiling wider than he had in years. About time, Daniel called out, chuckling warmly, and the kitchen filled with laughter for the first time in longer than anyone could properly remember. The wedding took place the following spring in the estate's garden, under an arch woven with white roses that Daniel had personally requested, insisting they matched the ones Sarah had chosen for her own wedding decades earlier. It feels right, Daniel explained. When Victor questioned the choice, his eyes soft with memory rather than grief. Not because Emily is replacing Sarah, but because Sarah would have loved her. She would have loved what she's done for this family. Victor stood at the altar that day, dressed in a simple gray suit, watching Emily walk toward him on Margaret's arm, Margaret, who had become something close to family herself over the past year, and who Emily had asked through tears to stand in for the father she'd lost years earlier. Grace watched from a wheelchair near the front row. Her health improved dramatically after months of proper treatment, her face glowing with a pride and joy that made Emily's heart nearly burst with gratitude. You look like sunshine, Victor whispered when Emily finally reached him, taking her hands in his. You look terrified, Emily whispered back, smiling. Terrified of how much I love you, Victor admitted quietly just for her. It's the good kind of terrified. They exchanged vows that spoke not of perfection but of honesty, promises to keep choosing trust even when fear whispered, otherwise promises to keep healing together rather than hiding separately, promises built on everything they had survived together rather than any illusion of an easy love. 1 year later, the Callahan estate looked nothing like the cold, silent house Emily had first entered as a desperate stranger seeking work. Laughter filled the halls regularly now. The kitchen buzzed with activity most evenings. Daniel often seated at the counter, offering unsolicited but cheerful commentary on Emily's cooking, his memory continuing to improve steadily with each passing month. Victor worked shorter hours, delegating more responsibility to a trusted team, prioritizing dinners at home over late nights at the office, in a way that would have seemed impossible to the man he'd been 2 years earlier. Grace had moved into a comfortable guest cottage on the estate grounds, close enough for daily visits, healthy enough now to spend afternoons in the garden with Daniel, the two of them swapping stories and laughing over tea, an unlikely friendship blooming between two people who understood better than most what it meant to fight for a second chance at life. And in the kitchen, on a quiet evening, much like the one that had started everything, Victor found Emily exactly where he always found her, humming softly, stirring a pot of something simple and warm, her grandmother's old recipe notebook open on the counter beside her. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin gently on her shoulder. "Smells wonderful." "Just something simple," she said, smiling as she leaned back into him. "Your favorite, actually." "Everything you make is my favorite," Victor said honestly, "because you make it." Emily turned in his arms, studying his face softer, now warmer, entirely transformed from the cold, guarded man who had once demanded to know who had dared cook a meal he'd finished without permission. "Do you ever think about that first night?" she asked. "When you asked who cooked it?" "Every single day," Victor admitted. "It's the best question I've ever asked, even though I had no idea at the time how completely the answer would change my life." "And now you know," Emily said softly. "Now I know." Victor agreed, pulling her closer. "It was you. It was always going to be you." They stood together in that kitchen, the same kitchen where fear had once tried to keep them apart, where doubt had nearly destroyed everything they'd built, where love had ultimately proven stronger than every wound either of them carried. Because that is the truth. This story leaves behind. Sometimes the person who changes everything is not the one with the most power, the most money, or the most protected heart. Sometimes it is simply the person who chooses again and again to remain kind, even when the world has given them every reason to stop, the one who walks into a broken house carrying nothing but an old recipe notebook and an unshakable belief that love, however buried, can always be found again. And in the end, that is exactly what Emily Carter did. She did not just cook a meal that night in the Callahan mansion. She rebuilt a family, healed a father, restored a broken man's capacity to love, and proved once and for all that the coldest hearts are never truly beyond saving. They are simply waiting for the right person to walk through the door and remind them how to feel again. Long after the wedding bells had faded and the seasons had turned twice over the Callahan estate, there came a quiet evening when Victor sat alone on the back terrace, watching the sun dip behind the tree line, and found himself thinking not about business, not about the empire he had built, but about a single, simple truth that had taken him nearly 40 years and unimaginable loss to finally understand. Love, he had come to realize, is never proven in the moments when everything is easy. Anyone can love someone when the table is full, when the house is warm, when nothing has ever gone wrong enough to test the foundation beneath the feeling. That kind of love is real, but it is untested. It is a seed that has never faced a winter. And for years, Victor had believed that his own capacity for love had died the night he lost Sarah, that whatever had made him capable of tenderness had been buried alongside her permanently, irretrievably. He was wrong. And it took a woman with nothing but a torn recipe notebook and a stubborn refusal to be intimidated to prove it. Emily found him there on the terrace, 2 cups of tea in her hands, and settled into the chair beside him without a word, the way she always did when she sensed him somewhere deep in thought. "You're doing that thing again," she said gently, "the thing where you disappear behind your own eyes." Victor smiled faintly, accepting the tea she offered. "I was just thinking about how strange it is the way love actually works. Nothing like what I believed when I was younger." "What did you believe?" "That love was supposed to protect you," Victor said slowly, choosing his words with the same care he might have used years ago in a boardroom negotiation, except now the stakes felt infinitely more personal. "That if you loved someone hard enough, carefully enough, you could shield them from anything. And when I couldn't protect Sarah, I decided the safest thing was to never let myself feel that much again. I thought love was a liability, a weakness other people could exploit. And now, Victor turned to look at her, the woman who had walked into his frozen house 3 years ago, and without any grand gesture, without any dramatic declaration, simply refused to leave him alone in his grief. Now, I think love was never supposed to protect us from loss. I think it's supposed to give us a reason to keep living, even after loss finds us anyway. Because it always does eventually. No amount of money, no amount of walls, no amount of control can keep grief permanently at bay. The only real choice we have is whether we let that grief close us off entirely or whether we let people back in despite the risk. Emily was quiet for a long moment, letting his words settle between them. I think that's the part most people get backward, she finally said. They think love is supposed to be safe, but real love was never safe, Victor. It was never supposed to be. It's terrifying precisely because it matters. If it didn't have the power to break you, it wouldn't have the power to heal you either. Those two things come from the exact same place. Victor nodded slowly, something settling in his chest, a truth he had been circling for months, finally landing with full clarity. That's exactly it. The same door that lets in loss is the door that lets in love. You can't lock one out without locking out the other. It was a lesson the entire household had learned in different ways across the strange and difficult year that had brought them all together. Daniel had learned it through memory itself, through the slow, painful process of allowing forgotten grief to resurface so that forgotten joy could resurface alongside it. For years, his mind had protected him by burying the pain of losing his daughter-in-law so completely that it had taken pieces of everything else with it, her name, her laughter, the songs she used to hum. But healing, real healing, required him to let that pain back in, however briefly, however painfully, because there was no way to reclaim the joy without also reclaiming the sorrow that had been wrapped around it. Grief and love are woven from the same thread, Daniel told Emily once during one of their quiet afternoons in the garden. You cannot pull one out without unraveling the other. People spend their whole lives trying to find a way around that truth. There isn't one. The only way through grief is through love, and the only way to love fully is to accept that grief will eventually be its price. Emily had carried that conversation with her for weeks afterward, turning it over in her mind the way she once turned over her grandmother's recipes, searching for the deeper truth folded into the words. She thought of her own mother, Grace, who had spent years loving her fiercely despite illness, despite hardship, despite every reason the world had given her to grow bitter or withdrawn. She thought of the countless nights Grace had hummed old songs while stirring pots on a stove in a cramped apartment kitchen, refusing to let poverty or fear steal the warmth she was determined to pass down to her daughter. Love isn't about having enough, Grace had told her once, long before Emily ever set foot in the Callahan mansion. It's about giving fully with whatever you have, even when it isn't much. Especially when it isn't much. That's when it means the most. Emily understood now more than ever exactly what her mother had meant. There is a particular kind of courage required to love someone after loss has already taught you how quickly love can be taken away. It is easy to love when the world has never wounded you. It is an entirely different act of bravery to love again after the world already has. Victor Callahan had once been a man who mistook control for safety, who believed that if he simply built high enough walls, hired enough security, accumulated enough power, he could somehow prevent tragedy from ever touching his life again. But tragedy does not respect walls. It does not care about net worth or influence or carefully constructed empires. It finds its way in regardless, the same way grief had found its way into a mansion staffed by dozens of people who could not, despite every resource available to them, protect one man from his own frozen heart. What ultimately saved him was not more control. It was less. It was the willingness to let someone in without any guarantee of the outcome, to let Emily cook in his kitchen, to let his father remember to let old wounds surface, even though surfacing was painful, because the alternative permanent numbness was a kind of death, far worse than any single loss could ever be. This perhaps is the deepest truth this story leaves behind for anyone who has ever loved and lost and wondered whether loving again was worth the risk. It is worth it. Not because the risk disappears, it never does, but because the alternative, a life spent guarding against feeling anything at all, is not actually safety. It is simply a slower, quieter kind of suffering one that convinces you it is protection, while it steadily hollows out everything that makes life worth living in the first place. Emily never set out to heal Victor Callahan. She never set out to heal Daniel or to mend a broken family or to restore laughter to a house that had forgotten the sound of it. She simply refused to stop being kind, even when kindness had cost her everything once before. She simply kept showing up, kept cooking simple meals with old recipes, kept treating a feared and broken man like an ordinary person, capable of ordinary tenderness, because that was who she had always been, long before she ever knew his name. And that, in the end, is perhaps the most important lesson of all, that healing rarely arrives through grand gestures or dramatic rescues. It arrives quietly, meal by meal, conversation by conversation, small act of consistency by small act of consistency. Until one day, almost without anyone noticing, exactly when it happened, a frozen heart discovers it has learned how to beat warmly again. Love, real love, does not ask us to be fearless. It asks us to be willing to be hurt again, willing to trust again, willing to let someone see the parts of us we have spent years trying to hide from the world. It does not promise safety. It promises something far more valuable, the chance to feel fully alive again, even knowing, even accepting that aliveness always comes bundled with the possibility of loss. Victor Callahan spent 3 years believing that the only way to survive love's absence was to never risk loving again. He was wrong. The only way to survive loss is to keep choosing love anyway, over and over each time it's offered, because a life spent refusing that choice is not really a life being lived at all. Somewhere in that quiet mansion outside New York City, a family that tragedy once tried to destroy sits down together most evenings, now sharing simple meals made from old handwritten recipes, filling rooms that were once silent with the sound of laughter and conversation and ordinary, unremarkable love. It did not happen because anyone was fearless. It happened because again and again, when fear whispered that it would be safer to stay closed off, every single person in that house chose to open the door anyway. And that more than any fortune or empire Victor Callahan ever built remains the truest measure of a life well lived. Not the walls we build to keep pain out, but the doors we choose bravely, imperfectly, to leave open for love to find its way back in exactly when we need it most.